talk about, building off your discussion already, is when you are finding the time to study, you're in study mode, how do you begin to tackle what you need to do? And how do you actually understand what you understand and know what you don't understand? And how do you decipher what I call the need to know versus the nice to know versus the nuts to know? Okay? And those are three different things that are very hard to begin to learn to decipher, because who here has ever sat down with any textbook and realized at the end of it that you've highlighted the entire chapter? Right? So that means that you're thinking everything is need to know, everything is need to know, everything's need to know, everything's need to know, everything's need to know, and you're not deciphering the need to know from the nuts to know. And what we want to do is we want to set you up in a way to be able to figure out what is it that I really need to know, so I can push the nuts to know out of my mind and not pay attention to those details. So really quickly, for those of you who don't know me, I am Dr. Delaney, and I have been a teacher here for this now my second year, but prior to this, I taught anatomy and physiology for 5 years. So I have a pretty good grounding of where this is coming from both student perspective and faculty perspective. And one of the things that I always find when students start anatomy and physiology is that they come into lecture and they look at me and they say, "It sounds like you're speaking a foreign language." Anyone ever had that experience? Like you're sitting in class and you're like, they might as well be speaking to me in French because right now nothing is connecting in my brain, right? It's because we are. Anyone know what anatomy and physiology is based in? Latin. So when you are signed up for an anatomy and physiology class, you didn't know you were getting a crash course in Latin, but you are. So one of the most important things that you can do before going into lecture is to go through the chapter. Not trying to understand what's going on. You go through the chapter to look at the vocabulary. What are some of the words that I'm going to hear? What am I expecting to learn in lecture that day? The textbook is not just for after lecture to fill in the blanks. The textbook is before and after lecture, and I'm going to show you how to use that as a tool today. So when you open your textbook, it's divided into different sections. Right? So I want to pretend we're in the heart. Okay, so I open my chapter to the heart, and I see that the first section is pulmonary and systemic circuits. What I want you to do there is read the first paragraph. Once you've read the first paragraph, you're going to say to yourself, what do I expect to learn from this section? And you write it down. So you guys tell me, if you saw the title Pulmonary and Systemic Circuits, what would you expect to learn as you read that section? Any guesses? What about what is the pulmonary circuit? What is the systemic circuit? Right? What's the difference between the two? So you're going to put down on your paper in your Word book, notebook that can, or if you're a handwriter, just a notebook that has a lot of space, but you're going to put down what you expect to learn. So I might say, I expect to learn what is the pulmonary circuit, what is the systemic circuit, what do they do, what's the difference between them, but once you do that, you now have an idea of what you think you're looking for. It's really hard to read if you don't know what questions you're asking. If I'm reading a news article, I might say, read the headline and say, okay, this headline is about, there was one I read that was really cool last night that totally grabbed my attention. So there was one that I read last night that said, Pennsylvania hospital uses escape rooms to teach nurses about sepsis. And I was like, that sounds kind of cool, so that grabbed my attention. But right away, I was thinking to myself, how did they use an escape room methodology? Did the nurses respond to it? Did they learn about sepsis from it? I had all kinds of questions, and was it a successful activity? So I knew when I was getting into that article what answers I wanted to gain from it. So when I read the article, I didn't read for all of the itty-bitty details. Because it was a nationwide article, I knew where Pennsylvania Hospital was. I didn't need to read the introduction to what it was. I was part of Penn Health System. I kind of scanned through that. But then when I got to the details of how they implemented it and the success of it, that I kind of tuned into because I knew that's what I was looking for from the beginning. So if you just go blindly into reading a chapter without knowing what to expect or what you're looking for, everything's going to seem important because you're not trying to answer any questions. So the first thing when you tackle a chapter is to say, what do I expect to learn? What are my questions? What am I expecting to gain from this? And then when you finish the chapter, you jump down and you say, what did I learn? And sometimes you're going to have all of your questions answered. You're going to say, I learned the difference between pulmonary and systemic. I learned what they are, what they do, why they're important. But you might also say, I also learned how blood travels through them. Wasn't expecting that. I didn't know this was about blood flow as well. So then you might have some additional things that you've learned about. Or, and this is going to happen, you're going to get to what did I learn, and you're going to put a giant question mark. You're going to say that entire thing seemed foreign to me. I did not grasp anything that went on there. This is why you want to do this before class. Because the parts that seem foreign to you are the parts that you need to be engaged in lecture in. Saying, can you explain that a little differently? I still don't understand what you're saying. Or if you're not comfortable doing that in class, going to office hours and saying, here is this section, I'm totally fine with these three, but this one is just backwards for me. Or sometimes you're going to say, you know what? The textbook is just not talking to me. So I'm going to go to an alternate resource to see if I can get it to explain. So where can you go besides your textbook to look for alternate information? Yeah?
You can go to YouTube for videos.
You got it. You can go to YouTube for videos, but make sure that you're looking at valid resources. So look that it's linked to a university. Look that it's linked to someone. You can look at their biographies, that they've actually taught anatomy and physiology before. Khan Academy is a great one that I know is always going to be able to provide strong resources for you in a video format if you're audio-visual. Because if you're not a reading learner, it's still important to go through and figure out what should I be learning in this section, but then it's okay to look at other resources that will speak to you. But unless you go through this process of what do I expect to learn from this section and what did I actually learn, you don't know where your gaps are. So the next thing that you're going to do is you're going to say, what did I learn? And this you're doing off the top of your head. You're not going back and looking things up. You're saying to yourself, what did I learn? Okay, so I learned the pulmonary circuit. Excuse my spelling errors, we're just going to go fast. I know the pulmonary circuit is between the lungs and the heart. Okay? Or you might be able to be more specific and say it's the lungs and the right side of the heart. Okay? And then you might be able to say, I know it's responsible for O2 and CO2 exchange. And then you might say, okay, the systemic circuit is the left side of the heart and the rest of the body. Okay, and that's responsible for dropping off O2 and nutrients and picking up waste. Okay. Now I have a summary in my own words of what I just read. If you can't summarize it without going back to the book, you didn't understand it. So you have to go through this exercise of what do I expect to learn? What did I learn? Can I put it in my own words? And when you're starting off, what you're starting off doing is just these broad summaries. Do I overall get what it's saying? Do I overall understand the process? Okay? And then you might say, okay, I also learned that how the blood flows through. I know that blood flow. It goes from the body to the heart, to the lungs, back to the heart, back to the body. Right? Really simple overview at this point, that you understand the process. I'm not putting technical names in. I'm not doing anything along those lines. I'm just saying, what can I quickly recall after reading this for the first time. Once you do this, now you're prepared to go to lecture. Now you're prepared to go to lecture and to be a prepared, in-tuned learner. You're not being exposed to this information, to this Latin for the first time. You are now ready to say, okay, I know what we're talking about in lecture, so now I can clue in, I can ask questions, or I can hold on to my questions for after class, because some people don't like asking questions in class, and that's okay. But then when you get home, you go back to your sections. And before you open the book, you do another one. You look at your titles of what you had, and you say, okay, the first one that I did was, again, pulmonary and systemic circuits. But now you try to fill in the details of what you heard in class. Because hearing in class is not mastering. Mastering is coming home and working within a couple of hours of what you just learned, putting it in paper in your own words. So now you might be able to go home and say, okay, same thing. My understanding of pulmonary versus systemic circuit hasn't changed. So guess what? You did it in Word, you say, okay, this is still the same. Copy, paste. I still know that. Okay, that hasn't changed. But now I understand a little bit more in depth about how the blood flow works. So now I can start to put some technical terms to it. And you can do a drawing, you can do a flow chart, you can do whatever works for you. But what you're going to do now is you're going to say, okay, so I know that the superior and inferior vena cava go to the right atrium. From the right atrium, the blood travels to the left ventricle. From the left ventricle, it goes to the pulmonary trunk, where then it goes to the lungs. That is the end of your, from the lungs, it goes to your pulmonary arteries. That's the end of your pulmonary circuit. Then you go, okay, what do I remember from there? From the pulmonary circuit, I know it goes to my, oh, I did right atrium instead of left, sorry. No, right and right. I know it goes to my left atrium. From my left atrium, it goes to my left ventricle. And from my left ventricle, it goes to my aorta, which then goes to the rest of my body. Now I've taken what I thought I understood, where I just did body, heart, lungs, body, heart, body, and now I'm putting the more technical terms into it, and the only reason why I can do that is because I understood the flow to begin with. Because if you just start here, this is not going to make any sense to you. If you just start with pure memorization of what you read in your book, or pure memorization of what you see in your PowerPoints or what you heard in lecture, and again, that application piece, you're not able to apply it, you're not able to put it into your own words, you don't have that material down. And so now what you can do is you can make it even more specific. You can say, okay, I know that the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava are part of systemic circuit, so I'm going to underline it. And then I know once I get into my left atrium, left ventricle, aorta, body, that's part of my systemic circuit. I'm going to underline it. And then you can say, okay, superior vena cava, right atrium, right ventricle, pulmonary trunk to the lungs, or let's say pulmonary trunk, that's deoxygenated blood. So now I can make that blue. And I can say lungs is where gas exchange happens. So I can make that purple. And then I can say pulmonary arteries, left atrium, left ventricle, aorta, body. That's where I now have oxygenated blood. So I'm going to make that red. Make whatever type of color coding pictures works for you. But now you're putting in all of your details of what's the difference. Well, I know the difference is what's between the pulmonary and the systemic circuit by drawing this out. I know what's involved in each of the pulmonary and systemic circuits. But I also know key information as well. I know where in these circuits the blood is oxygenated and where it's not. I know where gas exchange happens, because I know that lungs is purple, so that's where gas exchange is happening. And then I know when we get back to our pulmonary arteries and back into our left atrium, left ventricle, aorta body, now we're back into our oxygenated blood. So we're back to where we need to be in terms of the level of knowledge. If you don't start with this process though, you're constantly playing pickup or catch up. You're constantly playing catch up from the time you step into that classroom. Because what you're going to be experiencing is walking into a Latin class, not walking into an anatomy class. And so it's all going to seem foreign to you and you're not going to know what to do with it. Then from there, once you have that down, now you talk about it. The best way for mastery is to teach others. So this is where you get together with one person or a group of people, and you all have your own strengths or weaknesses, and you say, okay, we're going to meet tonight and talk about the heart. I'm going to take section 1, you're going to take section 2, you're going to take section 3, and we're going to explain it to each other. Ask questions from each other. That's where your highest learning and highest level of memorization happens. But this strategy takes organization. You have to be setting time aside before class to prepare for class and after class to prepare for class. What you can't expect from a professor is that they will give you all of the information in lecture. That is not the goal of lecture. The goal of lecture is to highlight the most important and or the most confusing information and try to explain it to you. But it's not going to be a comprehensive overview of the entire body system. There's not time for it. So as you come into a classroom, we expect that you've already done your baseline understanding. That at a minimum, you at least know that today we're talking about the heart. That at a minimum, you know what we're talking about today. But ideally, you've looked through the chapter, you know what you're expecting to learn that day, and then you're able to participate in class instead of be a passive watcher of class. And that difference between being a passive watcher in class and being a participator in class, and I don't necessarily mean talking every 5 minutes in class. I mean being a participator in class by saying, oh, this makes sense, I'm putting pieces together, I learned this, now I understand how this blood flow goes, things along those lines. That's what I'm talking about being a participator in class. That makes all of the difference in the world, and you're going to find that your study time after class is significantly diminished by putting that effort forward at the beginning because you are far more prepared to focus on application after class rather than going back and focusing on the nitty-gritty details that you didn't understand to begin with. So just to review, what you want to do to be successful in class is to read the book before you go to class. Okay? Again, you're not reading for complete understanding before you're going to class. You're reading to see if you recognize, so that you can recognize terms, and also so you know what you can expect to hear in lecture that day. You also are reading to see what stood out as very easy to you, and what stood out as very challenging to you, so you understand what you need to focus on in terms of assistance from the tutor, the professor, the TA, whoever it might be, or your classmates. Then when you get to class, you're filling in the gaps. So another really good way to get to class, or another good way to set up would be to set up your notes like this. With what I expect to know or to learn and what the professor talked about. Now you're super organized. You can say, I expect to know what is the pulmonary system. And you're not going to take notes on everything he says about the pulmonary system here, because you already understand it. Or you already have your notes on it from reading it before. What you're going to take notes on are the little tidbits of information that aren't in your textbook. So he's going to say, this is the pulmonary system, and you're going to say, great. Or this is the pulmonary circuit, and you're going to say, great. And then what you're going to do is the little tidbits of information he gives you about the pulmonary circuit that you didn't see in the book, that's what you're taking your notes on. It's the pieces that you didn't know or the pieces that you didn't grab. That's what you focus on. And then you set up that, and then you have a table. Okay, here's what I was expecting to learn. Here's what I learned in class related to it that was new information to me. Or stuff that I didn't see in the textbook, or stuff that confused me. And then you can also do this by saying, okay, I was expecting to learn this in class and he never brought it up. So let me see if he thinks this is valuable for me to study. Because that helps you get to the need to know versus nice to know versus nuts to know. When you're prepared, you're able to say, okay, he brought this up in class, this must be a need to know. He didn't bring this up in class, I'm going to double check with him or her, and I'm going to say, okay, he said that that's not something that's as important to focus on, so guess what? Those 4 paragraphs that I thought were super important, that falls into the nuts to know, and I don't need to worry about that. So this is how you're going to prepare. This is how to prepare to be successful. So if you have any questions, about how to study, how to prepare to study, if you have any questions, my office door is always open. I help kids through anatomy and physiology all the time, so feel free to come in and see me and ask any questions that you may have. And then we'll both open